Jordan Matthews was used to flying in first class. He was a successful young man, sharp, confident, and dressed in a crisp suit that matched his ambition. Today, he was flying to a big business meeting in another city, a chance to pitch a new project that could change everything for his company. But he wasn't thinking about the project just yet. He had another thing on his mind. As Jordan made his way down the narrow aisle of the airplane, he could feel eyes on him. He'd been in this situation before, walking into a room full of people who hadn't expected someone like him. His skin was a little darker, his clothes a little sharper, and his presence just a little too confident for their comfort. He reached his seat in first class. The flight attendants smiled and nodded politely, but there was something in their eyes. He knew they were wondering what he was doing there. They always did. Just as Jordan sat down and adjusted his tie, a voice called out from the front of the plane. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said. It was the pilot, Captain Ronald. He was tall, with a gruff voice that had a touch of authority. "You're in first class. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jordan looked up in surprise. The captain was staring down at him from the front of the plane, a slight smirk on his face. "Pardon me," Jordan said, trying to keep his cool. Captain Ronald chuckled softly, as if he had just made a clever joke. "First class, ah. I don't know, you don't exactly look the part." Jordan paused. He wasn't sure if the captain was joking or being serious. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he felt the sting of the words, the sharpness of the insult wrapped in a smile. "I think I'm in the right seat," Jordan said, keeping his voice steady, but his jaw tightened. The captain's eyes flicked over to the flight attendants, who were now looking at each other uncomfortably. It was clear this wasn't the first time Captain Ronald had made a comment like this. Jordan adjusted his collar and turned his gaze out the window, willing himself to stay calm. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life. He wasn't going to let some rude pilot ruin his day or his flight. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Jordan tried to ignore the feelings of discomfort still swirling in his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself. He was used to people underestimating him. He had faced that all his life. From childhood to the boardroom, he had always had to prove himself. He could still feel the captain's eyes on him, and he wondered what people like Ronald would think if they knew who he really was. What if they knew that Jordan Matthews wasn't just some kid with a lucky seat in first class? What if they knew he owned his own tech company, a startup that had recently secured millions in funding? What if they knew he was on his way to a meeting with some of the biggest names in the business world? But it didn't matter. What people thought of him was not the reason he was here. He was here for his future, for his dreams. And nothing, especially not some random insult, was going to get in the way of that. The plane lifted off the ground, and as it climbed higher into the sky, Jordan felt a little bit of that tension ease away. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the sound of the engines hum in his ears. He tried to focus on the meeting ahead. It was going to be a long flight, but he had everything prepared. His pitch was flawless. This was his moment. But just as he was about to lose himself in his thoughts, the intercom buzzed to life. "This is your captain speaking," came the smooth voice of Captain Ronald. "We're cruising at 30,000 feet, and I just wanted to remind everyone that we'll be serving drinks shortly. And we have a special guest boarding the flight today." Jordan raised an eyebrow. Special guest. He glanced around, but no one seemed to react. The voice continued. "I'd like to welcome a very important passenger. My mother will be joining us on this flight," Captain Ronald said, his voice a little louder now. "Please, when she comes aboard, make her feel at home. She's, very special to me." Jordan's curiosity piqued. He didn't know why, but something about the announcement felt off. Was this a joke? Was the captain really telling everyone about his mother? Before he could think much more about it, the flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. The plane was quiet again, and Jordan found himself gazing out the window, his mind drifting back to the business meeting. He had no time for petty distractions, no matter how strange they were. But as the plane continued its journey through the clouds, a strange feeling lingered in the air. The captain had introduced his mother. Who would that be? Was it just another way for him to show off? Or was there something more to this strange announcement? Then, a flight attendant stepped into the aisle, holding a small envelope. She looked at Jordan, smiled, and said, "Excuse me, sir, but the captain asked if you'd like to join him in the cockpit when we land." Jordan blinked in surprise. A special request from the captain himself. He wasn't sure what this was about, but he decided to play along. After all, the day was just getting started, and with the way things were going, he knew that nothing was going to be what it seemed. Jordan leaned back in his seat, his mind still spinning from the strange encounter with the captain. What did he mean, asking Jordan to visit the cockpit? And why was it so important that he mention his mother? It didn't make sense, and for a moment, Jordan let himself get lost in the questions. But then, the flight attendants were back, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Jordan took a glass of water and leaned back in his chair, trying to shake off the strange feeling. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, his thoughts began to wander, drifting back to memories that had shaped him over the years. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the engine soothe him, but the memories came anyway. The first time. Jordan remembered the first time he'd ever been judged because of the color of his skin. It was during his first week of high school. He was a shy, quiet kid back then, not yet confident in himself. His family didn't have a lot of money, and he didn't fit in with the rich kids who sat at the front of the classroom. He remembered walking into the cafeteria that first day, his stomach tight with nerves, only to hear a few snickers as he passed by. A group of students, laughing together, made sure he saw them roll their eyes as he sat down. Jordan tried to ignore it. He had learned quickly that people would always judge him, no matter how hard he tried to fit in. But it wasn't just the kids at school. His whole life, people had always underestimated him. At his first job interview after college, he'd been told he wasn't the right fit, despite his perfect qualifications. People at his job always expected him to fail, but instead, Jordan worked harder. He stayed late, he learned new skills, and he climbed the corporate ladder. But even when he made it, people still saw him as different. When he started his own company, some investors didn't want to take him seriously, even when his ideas were solid. They'd tell him to come back in a few years, or try again when you've got more experience. That was the way the world worked, wasn't it? People saw a young black man in a suit and automatically thought they knew everything about him. They never looked past his skin or his age. Captain Ronald's discomfort. Back on the plane, Captain Ronald's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting into Jordan's thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, his voice a little too loud, "we'll be cruising at this altitude for another hour. I'm sure you're all as comfortable as I am. I'll be in the cockpit if anyone needs anything." Jordan looked around the cabin. Some passengers were reading books, others scrolling through their phones. No one seemed to notice the tension in the air, but Jordan could feel it. The captain didn't seem like the type to get along with anyone who wasn't like him. Jordan could almost sense the man's discomfort, how he shifted in his seat whenever someone of a different background came near. Jordan knew the type, the ones who thought their world was just fine the way it was, unmoved by the changing tides of society, too comfortable in their own beliefs to ever challenge them. The ones who didn't understand that being a person was more than just looking the part. But that wasn't Ronald's fault. That was the world he had grown up in. The small acts of kindness. The flight attendants were walking up and down the aisle again, and Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice beside him. "Excuse me, sir," a flight attendant said quietly. "The captain asked if you'd like to meet his mother when she boards." Jordan smiled politely, trying to mask the growing confusion in his mind. "Sure, I'll meet her." He had no idea why the captain would want him to do this, but his curiosity got the better of him. He wasn't going to let a moment like this slip by. Besides, It wasn't often he was asked to meet someone important on a flight. As he sat waiting, Jordan's thoughts shifted again, this time to his family. His mother, who had always believed in him, always told him he could do anything he set his mind to. She had been the one who kept pushing him, teaching him not to listen to the judgments of others. She had raised him to be strong, not to back down, and to stand up for himself. He remembered when he was younger how she had worked 2 jobs just to make sure he could attend the best schools. The sacrifices she made to help him achieve his dreams were endless, and yet it never seemed enough for people in power. They saw a black man and assumed he was destined for nothing more than a simple life. But they were wrong. Jordan had worked hard to build his company. He had surrounded himself with smart, ambitious people. He was proud of what he had accomplished, despite the doubts and the hurdles he'd faced along the way. Now, it seemed like this pilot, Captain Ronald, had a similar mindset. He probably hadn't even realized the hurt his words had caused. Jordan had experienced this before. People like the captain thought they were just joking, but they didn't see the impact their words had. The woman who stepped into the airplane seemed to radiate grace and warmth. She had an aura of elegance, and as she made her way down the aisle, every passenger seemed to notice her. The flight attendants, who had been calm and polite just moments ago, suddenly seemed more alert, as if they were welcoming royalty. Jordan stood up to let her pass, his curiosity growing with each step she took. He had seen many wealthy passengers in first class, but there was something different about her. She wasn't just another passenger. There was something about the way the flight attendants looked at her that suggested she held far more importance than anyone else on the plane. As she passed, she smiled at Jordan. "Excuse me, young man," she said kindly, "but I believe this seat belongs to you." Jordan blinked, surprised by the way she addressed him. Was she talking to him? Before he could respond, she gently placed her hand on his arm and leaned closer, whispering, "You remind me of someone I know." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected a stranger to speak to him this way, and certainly not with such warmth. The flight attendants, meanwhile, seemed to be nearly tripping over themselves in their rush to assist her. They showed her to a seat right next to Jordan. As she sat down beside him, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The other passengers couldn't help but notice the sudden attention. But Jordan, still confused by the whole situation, tried to keep his focus on his own thoughts. The moment the woman settled into her seat, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce my very special guest for today's flight. My mother, Mrs. Eleanor Ronald." Jordan froze. Mrs. Eleanor Ronald. The name hit him like a wave, and his mind raced with the realization. This woman wasn't just another rich passenger. She wasn't just someone who happened to be on the same flight as him. She was the captain's mother. But what struck Jordan even more was the way the flight attendants reacted. They seemed almost reverent. It was clear this wasn't just a casual family visit. There was something deeper here, something Jordan wasn't yet able to grasp. The woman turned to Jordan and offered a smile. "I'm Eleanor," she said, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Jordan shook her hand, still unsure of how to respond. He was still processing the fact that this was the captain's mother and the strange series of events that had led him to this moment. Just then, Captain Ronald's voice returned to the intercom. "I hope you all enjoy your flight. We'll be at cruising altitude for the next hour. And once again, please join me in welcoming my mother on board," he said, his voice filled with pride. Jordan couldn't help but wonder if Captain Ronald was aware of what was happening. The way he had introduced her to the passengers, it was almost as if he didn't care that his mother was clearly a very important person. Or maybe he simply didn't realize the significance of the moment. He didn't know, but what he did know was that Mrs. Eleanor Ronald was no ordinary woman. There was something in the way she carried herself, something in the way the crew treated her, that made Jordan pause. "I hope I didn't interrupt your thoughts," she said, noticing that Jordan was still looking at her with a puzzled expression. "I just wanted to introduce myself before we start chatting. I've heard so much about you, Jordan. Jordan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You've heard about me? Yes, she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. I've been following your career for some time. Your company has made quite a name for itself. I'm quite impressed with everything you've achieved. Jordan felt a strange mix of emotions. The last time someone had mentioned his company so casually, it had been in a board meeting, not while sitting next to a woman who seemed to know more about him than he expected. He was about to say something in response when Captain Ronald walked into the cabin, making his way toward the front. As he passed by his mother's seat, he smiled at her with what appeared to be a mixture of affection and discomfort. "Mom," he said, "I hope you're doing well back here. Can I get you anything?" "Thank you, Ronald," Mrs. Ronald said warmly. "I'm fine, but I'll have a glass of wine when you have the time." Captain Ronald nodded, his eyes lingering on Jordan for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. It was then that Jordan noticed the tension in the captain's body. He couldn't be sure, but it seemed like Ronald was avoiding looking at him too much. Was it because of the earlier comment, or was there something more at play? The silence between them grew thick, and just when Jordan was about to ask Mrs. Ronald what she meant by following his career, she leaned in and spoke softly. "You're more than just a businessman, Jordan," she said, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I can tell you have big plans for the future, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." Jordan looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" But before she could answer, the intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Ronald's voice crackled, "we'll be beginning our descent soon. Please prepare for landing." Mrs. Ronald turned to Jordan, her expression turning serious for a moment. "I think you'll be meeting someone important once we land. Someone who can help you take the next step." Jordan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What was she talking about? Who else was going to be involved in this strange flight? And why had it all started with a comment from the captain? The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was far from clear. As the plane began its descent toward the city, Jordan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. Every time he tried to focus on the business meeting awaiting him on the ground, his thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Eleanor Ronald and the strange tension between her son and himself. It was as if something deeper was going on, something hidden just beneath the surface. He glanced out the window again, watching the city grow closer. His mind was racing, filled with questions. Why had the captain asked him to meet his mother? Why had Mrs. Ronald said she'd been following his career? And what was this big step she'd hinted at? Everything about this flight was starting to feel like more than just a coincidence. As the plane finally touched down, the familiar hum of the landing gear quieted the cabin, and Jordan felt a jolt as the wheels met the runway. The passengers around him began to stir, gathering their things and preparing to disembark. But Jordan remained still, his hands resting on his lap as he stared ahead, lost in thought. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through the intercom once more. "We have arrived. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop." Jordan's gaze flicked to the front of the plane, where Captain Ronald was walking down the aisle, his face tight with what appeared to be worry. As he passed by Jordan's seat, he barely acknowledged him, focusing instead on the flight attendants near the cockpit. His mother, Eleanor, was already standing, ready to leave. The atmosphere was strange, thick with an unspoken tension. Jordan stood up slowly, his legs stiff from the long flight, and moved to gather his belongings. He wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was certain. Something big was about to unfold, something that would tie him to the Ronald family in a way he hadn't anticipated. As he walked toward the exit, he noticed Mrs. Ronald standing by the door, waiting for him. She was talking to a flight attendant, but as Jordan approached, she turned her head, giving him a welcoming smile. "You didn't think I'd let you leave without having a word, did you?" she asked, her voice light, but with a hint of something serious behind it. Jordan forced a smile, still unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I guess I was expecting a quick goodbye." "Well," she said, stepping closer, "I'd like to invite you to dinner tonight. It's important we talk. Dinner. Jordan didn't know what she wanted to talk about, but there was no way he was going to turn her down. He nodded, swallowing the unease that had settled in his throat. Of course. Where? He asked. Meet me at the restaurant inside the airport. The one on the top floor, she said with a mysterious smile. I'll be waiting. Before Jordan could respond, she had already turned and walked off the plane, leaving him standing there, wondering what he had just agreed to. The restaurant on the top floor. Jordan made his way through the terminal after disembarking, still processing the strange chain of events. He was about to meet the mother of the captain who had, just hours earlier, insulted him. And now Mrs. Ronald wanted to have dinner with him, like it was the most natural thing in the world. As he entered the airport restaurant, Jordan was immediately struck by its quiet elegance. The lighting was soft, casting a golden glow over the tables, and the view of the city below was breathtaking. He saw Mrs. Ronald seated at a corner table, sipping a glass of wine. She looked completely at ease, as if nothing was unusual about this meeting. When she saw him approach, her smile widened, and she gestured for him to sit down. I'm so glad you could make it, Jordan. I know you're busy, but we need to talk, and I think this is the best place to do it. Jordan sat down across from her, his mind buzzing with questions. What is it you want to talk about? He asked, trying to sound casual despite the anxiety building in his chest. Mrs. Ronald took a sip of her wine, then set the glass down gently. Well, I'll get straight to the point, she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. You've been successful, haven't you? Your company, your career, everything you've done has been impressive. But I'm afraid there's something you don't know about the people around you, about your business, and about your future. Jordan leaned in, intrigued but confused. What do you mean? She paused, then looked around the restaurant, ensuring no one was listening. There are people in your life who aren't who they seem to be. People you trust. People who have helped you along the way. But they don't have your best interests at heart. Jordan's stomach tightened. He had heard rumors about betrayal in the business world, but he didn't expect it to be this close to home. I'm not sure I understand, he said quietly. Mrs. Ronald leaned in even closer, her voice low. Your company. It's worth a lot more than you think. But there are people who are watching you, trying to take it from you. And I'm not just talking about competitors. Some of these people are closer than you think. A chill ran through Jordan's spine. He'd always trusted his team. But what if someone was working against him in the shadows? Why are you telling me this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because, Jordan, you've always been underestimated. And I think it's time you stopped letting people walk all over you. The two men walked into the restaurant like they owned it. Their dark suits and stern expressions made the entire room feel suddenly smaller, as if the air had thickened. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone commanded respect. Jordan's eyes locked with one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with sharp features and a cold gaze. He was one of those types who had an aura of power about him. Someone who didn't need to introduce himself to make his intentions clear. The other man, a bit shorter but with the same intimidating energy, moved slightly behind the first, as if to show he was the secondary player in whatever game was about to unfold. Jordan's heartbeat quickened as Mrs. Ronald turned her head to greet them. Her smile was polite, but there was something about the way she met their gaze that made Jordan feel uneasy. She wasn't surprised to see them. In fact, it almost seemed as though she was expecting them. Well, Mrs. Ronald said, standing up gracefully, I'm glad you could make it, gentlemen. The taller man stepped forward, his eyes scanning Jordan with a chilling precision before he turned his attention to Mrs. Ronald. You know we don't have much time, he said, his voice low and controlled. Of course, she replied, her tone cool but composed. But I thought it would be appropriate for Jordan to understand what's happening before we proceed. Jordan sat frozen at the table, trying to make sense of the situation. His stomach twisted into knots. What was going on? What did these men have to do with him? And why was Mrs. Ronald so calm about it all? The taller man turned his attention to Jordan now, his gaze as sharp as a knife. "You're the one we've been watching," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The one who thinks he's playing the game, but doesn't know the rules." Jordan's throat went dry. He didn't understand what he was hearing. "What game?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Who are you?" The man gave a small, humorless smile. "We're the ones who hold the power in this industry. We're the ones who decide who wins and who loses." His eyes flickered toward Mrs. Ronald, then back to Jordan. "And we've decided that you're a player we can use." Jordan's mind raced. Use? What was he talking about? He was the CEO of his own company. He wasn't some pawn to be moved around. "Let me make this clear," Mrs. Ronald said, cutting through the tension in the air. "Jordan, these men are part of a group of investors who hold a significant stake in your company. You've been under their radar for a while now, but we've kept you in the dark about their involvement until now." Jordan blinked, trying to absorb what she was saying. His company had investors, yes, but he didn't know of any group with that kind of control. He had always prided himself on making sure he knew every detail about his business. How could this have slipped under his radar? The taller man stepped closer to the table, his cold gaze never leaving Jordan. "We've been monitoring your rise for some time. Your talent, your drive, these are things we can use. But the moment you step out of line, the moment you think you can make decisions without consulting us, we'll take over." Jordan's pulse thundered in his ears. This was a nightmare, wasn't it? He had worked his whole life to get to this point, to build something from the ground up. And now these strangers were telling him that his success had been a result of their manipulations. "You're saying you control my company?" Jordan asked, his voice tight. "Not yet," the man replied, his lips curling into a smirk. "But we will. And there's nothing you can do about it. The deal has already been made, whether you know it or not." Jordan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He had built this company with his own sweat, his own blood. It was his dream. And now these men were telling him it was all just a game to them. "No," Jordan said through gritted teeth. "This is my company. I won't let you take it." Mrs. Ronald watched him for a moment, then spoke softly, but with an edge of warning. "You think you have control, Jordan, but I'm afraid you've been living in a fantasy. These men, they have the power. And you've always been one bad decision away from losing everything." Jordan shook his head, refusing to believe it. "You're lying," he muttered, though doubt began to gnaw at him. The shorter man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "No, he's not. But you've been too focused on the wrong things. We've given you time to grow, to prove yourself. But now, you'll play by our rules." The tension in the room was suffocating. Jordan felt like he was trapped, suffocating beneath the weight of the truth crashing down on him. This was his life, his future, his legacy. And yet, it was all being taken away from him, piece by piece, by people he had never even known existed. "I don't need you," Jordan said, trying to regain some control, his voice more forceful. "I've worked too hard to let anyone, especially you, take this from me." Mrs. Ronald's expression softened for just a second before it became serious again. "You don't have a choice, Jordan. You never did." The men exchanged looks, and the taller one stepped back. "We'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow, Mr. Jordan," he said, his words chilling. "Be prepared to make your decision." Jordan spent the entire night tossing and turning, his mind consumed by the events that had unfolded in that restaurant. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the two men in sharp suits, the coldness in their eyes, came back to haunt him. The words from Mrs. Ronald echoed in his head. "You think you have control, Jordan, but I'm afraid you've been living in a fantasy." He clenched his fists under the covers, frustration and helplessness eating away at him. He had always believed that if you worked hard enough, if you had enough determination, you could achieve anything. But now he was starting to wonder if that was all a lie. He was alone in this. His company, the thing he had built from nothing, was no longer his. There were invisible hands pulling the strings, deciding his fate. And the worst part was, he had no idea who to trust anymore. The following morning, Jordan arrived at the office early, trying to force a sense of normalcy into his routine. He passed through the halls of his company, nodding at the employees he'd worked with for years, all of them blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. He made his way to his office, but as soon as the door shut behind him, the weight of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. The board meeting was today, the moment of truth. He didn't have a plan, at least not yet. All he had were questions, and that terrifying feeling that everything he had worked for could be taken away in a heartbeat. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Ronald. "Be at the boardroom at 10 a.m. sharp. The game begins." His heart sank as he stared at the message. The game. It was like they were playing with his life, like he was nothing more than a pawn in a game of chess. But he wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't just let them win. He took a deep breath and headed to the boardroom, his mind racing. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, trying to form a plan, trying to figure out a way to fight back. But as he entered the room, he saw the faces of the board members already gathered around the long table. It was like the calm before a storm. He nodded at a few familiar faces, but his eyes kept darting around the room, looking for something, anything, that would give him a clue about where he stood in all of this. The door to the boardroom opened, and Mrs. Ronald stepped in, followed by the two men from the airport. The same cold expressions on their faces made Jordan's stomach twist. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. It was like everyone knew something he didn't. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Ronald said with a warm smile, but Jordan could hear the edge in her voice. "I trust you all had a good night's rest. Today, we're going to discuss the future of Jordan's company. But first, I think we should address the elephant in the room." She looked directly at Jordan. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jordan's pulse raced. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. Mrs. Ronald's smile remained, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Jordan, as you know, there's been some restructuring happening. Our company has grown significantly, and it's time for us to make some major decisions about leadership." Jordan's eyes narrowed. "Restructuring? You mean you've been planning this all along, behind my back?" The tension in the room thickened. Mrs. Ronald's smile faltered for a split second. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be," she said coolly. "This is a business decision, and we're here to do what's best for the company." The taller man, the one who had spoken to Jordan earlier, stepped forward. His cold eyes flicked to the other board members before returning to Jordan. "Let's be clear, Jordan. This isn't personal. It's just business. And we all know that in business, sometimes sacrifices have to be made." Jordan's fists clenched under the table. "You're trying to take my company," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "This is my dream. And you can't just. You can't fight us, Jordan." The shorter man cut him off, his voice firm. "You're not in control here anymore." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them were already looking down at the table, avoiding eye contact. Jordan's mind spun. He had to do something. He had to fight back. Before he could respond, Mrs. Ronald raised a hand to silence the room. "Jordan, it's over. You had your chance to prove yourself. But now, it's time to step aside. Your company will remain in good hands." Jordan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not stepping aside," he said, his voice a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Not without a fight." A low chuckle escaped from the taller man. "Then prepare yourself," he said, his tone menacing. "Because we're about to make you an offer you can't refuse."